Here we go. Tonight's session is about how to store those garden crops. I thought this was a particularly inspiring or just empathetic picture of, oh, now I've grown it. Now, how do I keep that garlic from sprouting and all those other things that I have to pay attention to? So we are going to see first a couple of pictures that we've all seen a million times. One is this one. And it is because we're going to talk about how to store things in the garden and cellared, and you don't have to go into the ground for that. You can just do it in the garage. We'll talk about freezing things, and in fact, keeping things in the fridge. You can keep some things for super long time. I'm going to talk about a pitch for freezing prepared stuff. And we're going to talk a little bit about drying, and I'll give you some links for fermenting. So we're not doing canning tonight, but we're going to do all this other stuff. And first we will talk about holding the stuff in the garden itself. But I'd like to say, as we go along here, if you have ideas for how to use things or use foods in the winter, or recipes that come to mind that you can freeze or anything like that you'd like to share, I will have a document that you can send it to me, and I'll put it in a doc and I'll send it back to everybody who wants it. We did already talk about growing food, what to plant for winter. We already talked about this in the July class. So we're not talking about what to plant so we can eat in the winter. We're saying now that you have it, this is how to store it. But if you are curious and you missed that class, you could take notes now about what you'd like to have over winter for next year, for planting next year. And I have on the resource page, there's even a winter calendar, a planting calendar that tells you when to plant stuff so that you can eat it in the winter. You don't plant it now. But yeah, you can do that. You can also buy, if you don't have things coming out of your garden, we have farmers who have winter storage crops for you. So from the farmer's market, you can get these. I'm going to cite Betsy Wittig as an example for a few things in the class, but all the farmers can be a source for these things. Betsy Wittig of Laughing Crow Farm specifically grows storage crops, so potatoes and garlic, and I think onions sometimes, and she also grows peppers, and she has a special on peppers at the end of the year when she has a lot of peppers. It's usually in September. So she has fill a bag, and it costs less. And you can store those peppers in a prepared state, we can say. So I'll probably refer back to her. But this, if you don't have stuff coming out of your garden right now, you can still use this session. So this we've seen like every class. Absolutely every lump in that picture is food. So we're going to talk about how to keep things in the garden that you might already have in the garden. So the top row here, the first thing is on the left right here, is called mosh. It's a teeny tiny green. It's super cold hardy, and it doesn't usually need cover. You are welcome to cover any of the things in this picture, but it's a very cold hardy green. The other three things right here, these three, are all related to cabbage. So Brussels sprouts and two different kinds of kale, they do really well without a cover here. Have I ever covered them? Yes, but their brothers who were uncovered because I didn't have enough covers were fine. Some people do, if they have a very harsh environment in their garden, they do throw a 5-gallon bucket over their Brussels sprouts when the snow is coming or when the temperatures go into the teens. They will cover them up. I'm interested if any of you have had cold damage to your brassicas. John, yours just like mine, they just look like they're dead, and then the temperatures rise and they come back up, right?
I've seen kale do that a couple of winters in a row. It lays right down flat, and then it comes back as soon as it warms up. Exactly.
Yeah, they actually alter how much water's in their leaves so that when the water freezes, it doesn't pop the leaves. Yeah. And then This on the right is a giant spinach. You can get giant winter spinach, or you can get Bloomsdale, and those both do very well in the cold. I sometimes throw a tunnel over those, but I've also seen especially the giant winter spinach disappear underneath the snow with no cover and then come out looking fine, which is quite strange, but it's a fact. So the thing about these is none of them has a head like a broccoli or a cauliflower. If it has a head like a broccoli or cauliflower, this part is frost sensitive. So these in this row I put under a tunnel. This one is a leafy green called escarole, but it also applies to lettuces. That these I do put a low tunnel over those. And bok choy, I cover that up. And chard will freeze back if it's not covered. It'll often freeze back, but it'll come back from the root in the spring and give you a few leaves before it tries to bolt. But I sometimes cover my chard because I haven't harvested all of the leaves. And it is pretty cold sensitive even when it's covered. So what I try to do is harvest absolutely as much as I can. And then I might throw something over it just to preserve more of the growth points so I can get a better crop when it does start to grow again. So yeah, those require some cover, and I'll show you what kind of covers you can use. And then these are the root crops, and they die, their tops die back or they wilt or they look terrible in the winter, but we put 5 inches of chopped leaves over the top. That's so that when the ground does freeze, what really only freezes is the top of those leaves. We don't want carrots that have frozen in the top. So that's the deal with that. These are various ways that you might cover things. So for the purposes of our discussion, these are staying out. These are parsnips, and I actually don't cover my parsnips very much. This is some root crop that's covered up with chopped leaves. These are the low tunnels. They are super easy to make, very mobile, easy to anchor down, inexpensive. The description for how to make these is in the March class. It's on the resource page, and it says something like make low tunnels, and it has a link to the video for that class. So there's the July class if you want to know what to plant, and then the March class if you want to know how to make these low tunnels that are great for lots of protection. Even protection in the cool spring weather when you want to get things growing more. This right here is called row cover. It looks like Kleenex, but it's tough. It's a spun poly product. People call it Rime. And if you get a heavy one, they make them in different weights, basically. If you get a heavy one, it can give you a few degrees of frost protection. Sometimes you need to put it over a tunnel like this, a supporting frame like this, because if it's very windy and you have it on top of something that's leafy, it'll sometimes blow back and forth and sort of abrade the leaves and make them scarred and less palatable, you might say. But often you can just, if you have a tough crop, you can just lay it on top as well. Here are some other covers. That's a tunnel sloppily slapped together. They're usually tidier than that. These are refrigerator drawers from a fridge that died. That is a broken Rubbermaid box that somebody was throwing away, and I said, hey, can I have that? And this one is a 1970s bubble umbrella that the handle broke off of. So you can just, if you just always have those trash eyes on, you can definitely find things to use for this purpose. This is what's described in the July class. And you can make these tunnels short or long and high or quite low if you want. But I'm not going to go into details about that, but that's coverage. So that was how to keep things in the garden. But sometimes we don't want to keep things in the garden. We want to keep them in the fridge. And one case where we might want to keep some things in the fridge is maybe you have voles in your garden and they're using the winter to eat their way through your beets. They particularly love it when we put the chopped leaves on top of things. Or sometimes people, instead of using the chopped leaves, they'll throw cardboard, a couple of layers of cardboard over their beet crop. That cover unfortunately, encourages voles. So most of the time I don't have any problem. A couple of times I've had a couple of nibbles. And then one year when I had a massive vole problem and I knew it, I covered up my garden and left it covered. That was my problem. They really ate a lot of it. So what I do now is I keep an eye on the weather, and when it's going to freeze, I take that trash can full of chopped leaves that I have and I dump it on my root veg. And then when the frost and the freeze is gone and the rains come back, you know how we'll get it for a week, 2 weeks, and then the rains come back? I kick those leaves off to the side because I don't want to leave them on there too long for the voles. So you'll have to get to know your garden and know what happens in your environment. But one reason you might try to use your refrigerator is you might say, I'm going to dedicate some space and the cold is coming. I am going to cover up some of my root crops, but I'm going to pick myself some carrots and beets and parsnips so that I get some too. So I'm going to put those in the fridge. So how do we long-term store in the fridge, or short-term for that matter? One thing is to realize that produce is still alive. If I lost part of my body, it would not stay alive, but you can pull something off of a plant and it continues to do metabolism. So it's taking in oxygen and giving off CO2 and water vapor and ethylene gas, which makes other things around it ripen. And also there's heat just from your garden. So what we need to do is drop that metabolism without letting the thing dry out. I hope this creepy looking melon is now burned in your brain so that you can remember that. So we put it in the fridge and it turns out like this. The fridge seems really damp, right? Like the insides sometimes get condensation. The fridge is not a damp environment, actually. It feels damp because cold air can't hold moisture, so that moisture falls out onto surfaces. And then it's your fridge's job, actually, part of the cooling process, is to pull the moisture out of the air. So the other day, it was a sunny day, and I checked the relative humidity. It was about 66%. And then I looked at the refrigerator humidity. Fridge humidities are usually between 35 and 50%. So it's much lower. So it's going to dry stuff out. So how do we overcome that? We get it out of the sun after we pick it because it's going to give a lot of moisture off. And we chill it uncovered. If we have greens, we put it in cold water and then spin it dry. You don't need a salad spinner. If you have a pillowcase that's really clean, like this, just go out and spin it around like my mother did. And then we can bag things after they're cold. Now, I'm mentioning this and you might think that's insulting. I know you have to put things in bags, but so many people say, oh, cucumbers don't last very long. Well, they do if you bag them. So smart people, but sometimes we don't realize that you really can put them in a bag or another container. You do need an air gap for, especially if you're storing long-term. If you're storing just lettuce and I'm going in there every day, I'm opening the bag. That's enough of an air exchange. But if I have, say, beets in a bag or something like that, I do want that humidity that the bag affords, but I want to leave the top of the bag open just a little bit and maybe punch my finger in a couple of places on the bottom of the bag, and that'll give humidity. You know what a perforated bag looks like in the grocery store? Those perforated bags are specifically to maintain humidity in there without it being sopping wet, because the sopping wet encourages bacteria. And if you are a cucumber grower and you're growing pickling cukes and you're waiting until you have a jar's worth so you can make pickles, you get one on Monday and you get one on Wednesday and you get one on Friday, and you keep waiting and picking. And by the time you have enough for a jar or a batch or whatever, the first ones have rotted in your fridge or shriveled. You can wrap them dry, so get them cold, and then wrap them in a super clean towel individually, like wrap it, put another one down, roll it, put another one down, and stick it in a bag, and they'll keep a lot longer that way. Just a tip. Does anybody have anything else to say about keeping things in the outside garden or in the refrigerator? Any tips? I'm not looking at the chat. For long-term refrigeration, it's kind of the same thing. You want to rinse them really carefully and very gently. Don't rub potatoes when you're bringing them out of the ground. And do leave a little bit of stem on your root crops. Don't cut that off. And then it's just like refrigerating anything else, except don't take it as a sign of failure. If you have something in the bag, one of them goes bad. That process of checking and culling is something that we've been doing as long as we've been growing food. So it's just part of the way things work. If you want to learn more about storing things in like damp sand or damp sawdust or something like that, you can ask me about it and I'll come back to it. It's not, most people don't do that. It is possible. You have to keep things high on up so that you don't have rodents get to them, because you're not storing them in the fridge. You need a cold indoor environment, like the coldest outbuilding that you have and things like that. So I can tell you more about that, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that one. That's the old-fashioned traditional way of doing it, of storing things in places where the ground freezes. Here, you can just leave the carrots in the ground and take them up as needed. You can also store things in the cellar, which is the spot that I'm like in my garage. It's, you know, my husband will say, "Where is that?" And I'll say, "It's in the cellar where the roots are stored." So these are all things that we can store over winter. In fact, this is the one thing that you can plant soon. I don't know when do you all plant your garlic? Maybe you can type in, experienced gardeners, type in when you plant your garlic. I do it late October. But that is something that you can participate in. So around here, we actually do garlic over winter, and it grows a little bit. You can put it in now and you harvest it in late summer. But let's look at how we cellar some of these things. Okay, so there are very specific requirements for each crop. And in the resource page, I have a link to a chart that tells you exactly the humidity and the temperature that it wants to be. But both of these quotes are from a document about storing things, and they point out that a crop that lasts 8 months at its ideal 33 degrees might still last 4 months up to 50. So I, for example, have these massive squashes. Dang, I forgot to bring one. In my garage on a shelf. And it says they last 8 months under ideal conditions. Well, I'll tell you, they were there all summer when it was hot. You know, it wasn't 300 degrees in there, but it was pretty warm. And they've been at less than ideal conditions and all kinds of stuff. And I still have them, and they are a year old. So you pick the right things to store, and then you also just store them as close as you can. The garage often is pretty good for pretty good conditions. And then do eat what you store, because people will be so excited about storing, they try to stretch it and then it rots. And so it's better to finish it off a little early. Let's see, let's talk winter squash. Did you grow any winter squash, John Fawcett?
Yes, Hubbards and Delicata. The Delicata
Mm.
looking nice right now. The Hubbards are a little small. We got a late start because the deer stepped in and wiped them out. So we were about a month late.
Have you grown Hubbards before?
We have not. I don't think we've ever grown squash before.
Okay, good. I have a tip for you. But Hubbards, I've sometimes kept a Hubbard for a year. I mean, it might only last 4 months, but they can keep a really long time if they're really well cured. So here's what we do with winter squash. We wait as long as we can before the rains. So don't be eager to bring it in July. But it likes to have temperatures above 50, 55 degrees overnight. If it's continuously going down very low, then I would bring it in. It has the harvesting directions say harvest it either when frost kills the vine. We don't get frost until way after the rains start, so that doesn't work for us. Or harvest when you can't puncture it with your thumbnail. I have gardener thumbs. I could go through shoe leather with these things. All that means for me is it's not like it's zucchini that's really tender. I, but it's firm and I can't go through it without trying. Okay. It's I want that shell as hard as possible. And then we do something called curing. Curing just means keep it in your house on a porous surface like a piece of cardboard or a cloth with air circulation all the way around that squash. Looks like this. Let's see. I'll show you in a sec what it looks like. Air circulation so that it can get harder and drier. You can then, after that's happened, make a 10% bleach solution, so 9 parts of water and 1 part bleach, and then wipe it all over with that bleach solution, especially at the base of the stem because rot often starts there. And look underneath, sometimes rot can start down there too. It loves 55 to 65 degree temperatures and dry and lots of air circulation all around it. But that describes my garage in the wintertime. So sometimes my garage goes down to 40s and they say, don't ever store squash at the 40s. My squash is not affected by that. I don't know if yours would be, but mine is in good shape. And also it spends temperatures, high temps. It spends the summer at, at 78 sometimes in there, and it's still okay. So I think choosing a squash that stores long is a really good way to go. And here is one that stores a long time. It is sweet meat. And this one from Adaptive Seeds was actually rebred by Carol Deppy, who's a brilliant breeder. She said, you know those sweet meat seeds, it's an heirloom for the Northwest. They're not as good as they used to be. So I'm going to rebreed it and I'm going to make a line of seeds that has thick walls, just the right flavor, delicious seeds, stores a long time. So I particularly like the ones that you can get from Adaptive Seeds for these particular sweetmeat squash. I'm not saying you have to grow sweetmeat. It's a giant rambling vine. It likes 3 to 4 feet of root space all the way around it. So you could, when the plant is a baby, plant arugula or lettuces around it, but eventually it's going to want to take over that root space and it rambles. And then you think, well, I have to have a bed that's like 16 feet long because the vine's going to be that long. You don't. It'll ramble across your lawn just when the lawn goes dormant because you're not watering it. So that is not such a problem. You will only get, it says 3 to 4 fruits. I usually get, the best I get is 2 really big mature ones and then 2 little ones. But really, I think 2 is a more realistic number. And, but those sometimes are 18 pounds. So I get 36 pounds of amazing squash off of it. And people who eat it say, I'm not going to grow any other squash besides this. So you might make a note for this one and give it a try next year. Let's see. So curing a squash. Here are some squash that are curing. These 2 are sweetmeats. And these are all kakai, which is, I think it's listed on the resource page. This is just for fun. They are a smaller plant. It rambles a little bit. It's a little bit of a vining plant. They produce these naked pumpkin seeds, and they are better than the ones in the grocery store. Town and Country used to have 2 bins, and the ones that are darker green and wide, like these, were the ones that you should taste because they are kakai. They're more flavorful just raw than the other ones. They make the other ones taste like bits of crayon. So these are super yummy and they're great fun. Just if you want to show yourself how they grow, you want to show a kid how they grow. The downside is you don't get a huge number of them. You'll get maybe a cup. That's probably optimistic out of each pumpkin. And you only get 2 pumpkins per plant, but it's kind of a nice novelty. And that's another thing that you can store for winter. Also, this pumpkin doesn't taste that good, so you feed it to your friend's goats or something. Let's look at this. I have one tip. It looks like a huge lecture here, but that's just a tip. Don't you think that one pumpkin and maybe this orange pumpkin down here and that pumpkin would all be related? They sort of are, but they're not very closely related. These are related, those are related, and these are related. So it how it relates to storing things is this. See that this one has a hard 5-sided stem? You know what a pumpkin stem looks like, right? Here's a hard 5-sided stem. Cut those as long as you want. Never pick them up by that stem because you can break it off. See this? These are fleshy. So those are Hubbards. They're cylindrical and they are juicy kind of. They don't look it, but they are. These are the ones where this stem, if it's left long, can rot and it'll rot your pumpkin. It'll rot your squash. So you cut it to between 1/2 and 3/4 of an inch. So the remaining stub will dry out really fast. So you do that as soon as you harvest it. So that's a tip on those. Let's talk potatoes and storing potatoes. If you have a tip about storing potatoes, please let us know. Please tell us. I have something for you. I have a sortable chart. This is in the resource page. Check this out. It's a sortable chart and you can sort for whatever you want. Like you want some very mealy, floury potato because you love a baked potato. That's great. You can also sort by storage. So all of the ones at the top are now excellent storers, and that will help you to store your potatoes longer. You can also plant them a little bit later. Travis Sailing plants Yukon Golds right down here, which is a short season. It doesn't take them long to grow. He plants them at the beginning of June. I haven't done that. I use a longer season potato, which is Elba, and I plant that at the beginning of May. But I'm not out there putting them in March because I don't want them ripe. I don't want them ready in July, because my options then are to take them out of the ground so I can use that bed. Then they've already started sort of the drying out process and maybe shriveling later. I want them in the ground fairly late, but I also can't water or use that bed if they are done in July. I have to decide if I'm going to pull them out and store them so I can plant something there, or leave them in the ground and not water the bed, because at high temps, if you water the bed, they could either rot or sprout again. So I like them to mature in September. So I have some in the ground that are not mature yet. I mean, they're mature enough, but they haven't died back enough for my liking yet. Anyway, I think that's a pretty cool table. You can also just go get some from the nursery. It's no big deal. So I've already talked about some of these. You want to let them dry really completely. If you're going to wash them, you just use running water. Don't rub them. And you cure them in the dark. They'd love 45 to 60 degrees for a couple of weeks. And then for storage, they'd like it to be cooler and quite humid. But you know what? I don't have that. So I put them on in shallow boxes in the garage. I can stack the boxes then, so I don't have to dig through a box in order to cull them. And they're also not piled on top of each other, sweating and potentially creating bacterial colonies. I put them in my garage. I make sure that they are in a cardboard box so it breathes, but I also put a very loose black plastic bag over the top so that they have some humidity and darkness. And looking at that 90 to 95% humidity, what does that even mean? Well, our humidity in winter is 85 to 90%. That's pretty good. So if you can get cool temps, my garage in the winter is in the 40s probably, and 90% humidity, that's pretty close. You can also do a perforated bags in a little fridge, but you're going to use electricity for that, right? And you would have to set that fridge, dedicate it to not having other things in it that need to be actually fridge temp, because you would be setting that up to like 45 degrees or something like that. Don't store them with fruit because the fruit makes ethylene gas and it makes them sprout. And when they sprout in the springtime, as long as they're not green, you can take the sprouts off and eat the potato. How about garlic? See these hardnecks? They make a little fake flower while they're growing, and the stem makes a hard spot. So that's called a hardneck. Soft necks don't do that. The soft necks store longer because they have more sulfur in them, usually. I really love a hard neck because I like those big cloves. I don't like messing around with these teeny tiny cloves. And then your fingers get sticky and then the paper that's on the outside sticks to them and you're trying to clean up and it's a mess. So I do grow some soft necks, but also hard necks. But you know what else you can do with garlic? If you have a lot of it, say you buy a lot from Betsy Wittig, who does Laughing Crow Farm, and she grows a lot of garlic, you can buy it, you can break it into individual cloves and throw it in a Ziploc bag and put it in your freezer. You can take the paper off of it first if you want, peel it first, but you don't have to. You can peel it after it comes out. And it doesn't fall apart to mush. It's softer. It's a little bit softer when it comes out, but it's easy to chop, I've grated it, and it's easy to run through the press, garlic press. Is anybody, if you have a favorite type of garlic, like a favorite particular one, like Inchilium Red is a local soft neck, would you put it in the chat? That would be great. This is the how to harvest garlic. So some people harvest their garlic and then they let it dry muddy, but you don't have to do that. If you harvest it when you have 5 or 6 green leaves left, you pull it out, you loosen it with a fork and you pull it out of the ground. And then you take the outermost green leaf and you pull it all the way down like you're peeling off a tight sock. It should peel right off and take all the dirt with it. And if it didn't, you can sort of peel off the next leaf, or you want to leave on as many leaves as you can. So you try to do that with just one leaf if you can. And then we want to cure it in air, very dry air in the shade. And it likes to be 55 to 65 degrees. Mine goes below 50, so I know it's going to sprout later. So what I do is I store it out in my garage for as long as possible, and my garage is below 50. And then as soon as I get the idea that one little clove is starting to sprout, that's when I separate them and throw them in the freezer. Whoa. Onions, I have 2 that you might like to store in your garage, and you might want to grow them. Patterson, neither of these are sweet because the really sweet ones like Walla Wallas, they're sweet because they don't have a lot of sulfur in them, and that sulfur inhibits bacteria. But this is Patterson. I had a Patterson that was a year old. I'm not advocating that we keep food for a year, but it was like just as good as the day that it was pulled out of the ground. So Patterson is amazing. If you want an open pollinated one, if you don't know what that is, it means you can, it's not a hybrid is what it means. It's kind of complicated to explain what it means, but Patterson's great. And there's the other one is called Newburgh. It's very similar. I don't know how long Newburgh stores, but they say that it's a good storage onion. So both of those are in the resource page. So my question, oh yeah, don't store your onions and garlic with which like it really dry with potatoes. I wouldn't lock them into the same cabinet together because the potatoes put off a little bit more moisture than they prefer, I say. Now, how do we keep the mice from getting them? I think you could, I haven't done this, but many people use leftover net bags and hang them from the ceiling. Don't hang them right above a bookcase that's in your garage or something like that. It just occurred to me that the reason you see these hanging from the ceiling in a kitchen, an old traditional style kitchen, actually this occurred to me last year, but it was the first time. And they're always hanging pretty high, and there's like 2 feet between the bottom basket and the counter. I think that is to keep mice away. I could definitely see hanging these from the rafter in your garage somewhere, or an outbuilding that does not freeze, and keeping produce in there. I have one of these. It works well for keeping the mice away. It is darned hard to climb, I think. But what doesn't work is putting it right next to and then they'll just come over and they can get your stuff. I also have things in one of these. They have slatted interior shelves, and I don't find that the mice are in there. I've seen these metal cabinets. I bet they're pretty mouse proof. You'd have to check them out, but they do show up on Craigslist. If I used these, I would probably use oil from the dipstick of my car and a drill bit from my drill and drill some holes up all over the top of it because it needs more ventilation. We're going to talk freezer, unless you have any tips for how you store your veg in the garage or anything like that. Does anybody have a tip for keeping away the mice? Cats, maybe? Okay, we're going to talk freezer. I'm just going to quickly remind you that individually quick frozen is called IQF, and you put them in a single layer on some grease-proof paper on a sheet pan and put them in your coldest spot in your freezer. Before you do vegetables that way, you might want to blanch them. So I have a chart on the resource page, and this is what it links to. It's links to the instructions for blanching, and then how long you have to blanch any vegetable that you want to use, that you want to freeze. And you can do it either in boiling water or you can do steam blanching. So the reason we do that is vegetables have enzymes that don't deactivate when you freeze them, and it kind of degrades the quality of the veg. So if you just dunk them in hot water for a while, boiling hot water, and then icy cold water, it deactivates those enzymes permanently, and they don't degrade as badly when you freeze them. And I love having frozen veg. I think I'm an advocate of freezing veg. Plant those extra green beans so that you can make minestrone in 10 minutes in the middle of winter, and it's your food, which is fun. Okay, this is another odd little thing. My kid calls these food units. I called them pucks. Sometimes, especially with greens, I will come in with a massive load of chard and start rinsing it in the sink, put a pan on and get it hot. Throw the wet chard in the pan, and as soon as it's completely wilted, that's my blanch. I don't have to stick it under boiling water. It'll just steam down. And then I press it. I grab the leaves and sort of crush them into here. I don't smash them completely, but the moisture on them kind of makes an ice block. And I think it is better to freeze greens that way because they take up less space, but they also don't freezer burn as easily if they have sort of ice around them. And then I heat this pan slightly on a warm burner and slide a dinner knife down the side and throw them in a plastic bag later. This is a stainless steel muffin cupcake tin. You can find them, but they don't rust, which is nice. You could also use a silicone one. There are a lot of silicone ones in the thrift stores. So that's nice and easy, and they come out of the silicone pans really easily. You do want to put a silicone pan on a sheet pan because it's wobbly. Yeah. If you don't want to use plastic bags, this is a 1.5 pint wide mouth jar. So usually jars, even wide mouth jars, kind of go in at the shoulders a little bit. These don't have shoulders. They're as tall as a quart jar, but they're a little narrower. So the reason that's good for freezing is one, these pucks just slide right in and out and they don't get stuck. But the other reason it's good is if you put soup stock in this thing and it expands, it doesn't push on that little shoulder that would ordinarily be right here. As it expands, you can break a jar that's shaped like a mayonnaise jar. So these are great jars. They're not little, they're tall. Okay, I'm going to make a pitch for you to sometimes not just freeze plain veg, but to put a little bit of effort into freezer products because they are amazing to eat in the winter and they do a lot of things for you. So I see 3 ways to freeze food. You can freeze just the green beans or just the chard. That's great because it gives you lots of flexibility. So you're not committed to having lasagna because that's the frozen food you have. The other end of that is to meal prep and meal, like make lasagnas and quiches and stuff and put them in the freezer. Also useful. That's nice. But this middle ground I like also because it's doing some sort of prep heavy work from when you bring your crops in to make some prepared ingredients that can really enhance your meals later in the year. So like pesto base. So I have lots of basil right now and it's not going to last because it's getting cold. So I can make pesto base, and I say base because I don't freeze pesto because pesto has a ton of oil in it and it's got cheese in it. So I make it and I don't use all the oil. I use like a quarter of the oil and none of the cheese. And then that's more concentrated. And I make the little pucks and I put them into the jars. So the picture over here is these jars are in the bottom of my freezer in sort of a bin. And excuse me. And they are filled with prepared stuff and obviously a lot of juice in this case. From when my sister let me take 40 Meyer lemons on an airplane from her house. So I also have about, what's 16 times 12? I have that many red peppers about to come in. So I'm gonna make red pepper pesto. I have eggplants come in, so I'm gonna make baba ganoush, all kinds of stuff like that. So it does take a little bit of work. In the middle of winter, if I want pesto 6 times in the winter, maybe I'm not gonna make the pesto and go to the grocery store and all that kind of thing. But I've got it now. I can use my resources that I have, use them up, and have these great things in the winter as well. Also for things like if your onions are all bolting, I would not caramelize an onion for a recipe. If I had to do it 6 times in a year, I would just go, well, I'm not doing that recipe. But if I have a lot of onions and I caramelize all of them once, then I have these little pucks, little units that I can just take out. They freeze great. And we can say, oh, what's for dinner? I can say, how about one of those frozen pizza crusts with caramelized onions and some gorgonzola and some kale and some sliced pear on it. And suddenly we have this amazing thing. So there are lots of things that you can do that are a little bit more prep that you might want to save. Roasted squash counts because when we finally break into one of those big squash, you've got to use it or you've got to find a way to freeze it. So often I will roast the squash. I cut it into chunks about that big, flesh side up, no water, no oil. And I bake it so that it gets brown around the top and really soft. And then I take my ice cream scoop and I just scoop quarter cups and I freeze those. Because then if I have quarter cups, I can make, and I have a recipe link for you in the resource page, cornbread that's based on winter squash, sort of a ginger spice bread that's based on winter squash. And you can make any number of different squash soups. If you've got some sauteed onions and some squash in your freezer, done, you've got amazing, better than you could buy roasted squash soup in 15 minutes. A little orange juice, little curry powder maybe. And it's fantastic. And you don't even, it just takes no time at all. So who would want to do this? Well, if you want to increase your nutritional diversity in the winter, you would want to do it. You would, if you want to make your winter veg taste better so that you will eat more of it because you put pesto on it and you have it in some soup now. That's a great way to do it. And it speeds up your meal prep. Excuse me. And importantly, oh, got to take a break. Sorry. Importantly, your cleanup, because you just pulling things out of the freezer that don't make a lot of mess. It's great for families that want to spend their time visiting over a great meal that you didn't buy at McDonald's instead of cooking it. It's great for singles who say, I don't want to do some big faff if I have to make the meal and clean it up. But if it's already done, I'm more likely to do it. I'm more likely to get those caramelized onions and that squash out of the freezer. And parents who want to model varied veg. So you have these things ready, so you're not doing just the two easiest veg most of the time. It doesn't go broccoli salad, broccoli salad, broccoli salad, and the kids get used to that. And then you go squash and they go, ew, right? So it helps you to remember to make normal the variety of foods for your kids. Oh, I put two recipes. I put one recipe in for this cake. I'm trying to inspire you to share recipes. This cake is the New York Times most asked for recipe. And I have one recipe that Cooks Illustrated did where you cook the plums. They're both very similar, but they're in there. If you have those prune plums happening right now, and you'd think, oh, they're falling all over the place. They're all over the island. There are lots of them, and many people have them. These cakes are these little torts. They're only like an inch tall, and you can do them in a regular cake pan if you put parchment in the bottom of the pan. But this is a way to preserve plums, and you might think, well, it's just one cake. But you can freeze these guys and then wrap them in parchment and foil, and you can make a lot of them, and then you can spontaneously give them at Christmas time. And you can also do it. This is the same cake. This is a Basque pear that was just sliced up, and you don't have to do anything fancy to the pear. And they are fantastic. So I'm hoping that you also have some ideas that maybe you're inspired to share eventually. I'm going to skip this. You can dry this stuff too. I'm going to give you 4 ideas for drying foods. And I would start with the oven if you don't have a dehydrator. You may never want to be a dehydrator person. You don't have to invest in a big dehydrator because you can do this in the oven. I have a recipe for beet chips, and it works on parsnip chips too. I don't do parsnip chips across like this because I don't like the core of the parsnip. So I slice it this way. And when I get to the core, I rotate the parsnip and slice it again. So that recipe works for beets and parsnips. If your beets or parsnips are bitter, they're just going to get more intensity that way. So you want to start with good veg in the first place. And these make good gifts too. I don't have a recipe for kale chips, but there are many. If you've had kale chips from the bag in the grocery store, homemade kale chips just with salt and olive oil taste quite different. And I like them much better. I think the bagged ones are not a good advertisement for kale chips. You can also do apple rings, and you can bake them in your oven at 170. You have to do it for a long time, but if you have a puffy kind of soft apple that doesn't keep very well, and you're wondering what to do with it, it makes a great chip. And these are, if you do it for a long time, you can get them crisp. So when you reach in the oven and it's warm, if you try it, it's going to seem rubbery. So you take it out and you cool it and see, sorry, see if it's crisp once it's cooled down. And then especially for the apple chips, you want to get them into a jar, sealed in a jar as fast as possible because they reabsorb moisture from the air and they'll get soft again. These things, if you're going to make chips out of these veg, they should be 1/16 of an inch thick. So I'd actually remind yourself what a 1/16 of an inch looks like. A veg peeler can work. A mandolin can work. A mandolin is this thing over here. And they do show up in the thrift stores. Certainly you can buy one retail. They show up on eBay and things like that. But if you have one from the thrift store, you need to make sure it goes down to a 1/16 of an inch because some don't. This one is Cook's Illustrated's favorite, America's Test Kitchen's favorite. It's linked on the resource page. Those are the apples. If you have one of these show up in thrift stores too. You want to make sure they have all their parts when you get them. And they will core and slice the apple for you. And if the peeler's good on it, they will also peel it. Sometimes they don't peel very well. There are instructions about how to do it. I have a resource about drying and preparing foods. It's called the National Center for Home Food Preservation. It's a good idea to dunk them in vitamin C. It helps them to not go brown. They still go brown, frankly, but it helps a little bit, but it also inhibits bacteria that we might not want on them. And you want to oil the racks whenever you're doing this stuff, make sure the racks are oiled, because you can have absolutely crisp chips permanently adhered to the racks that you're drying them on. And I have these Talenti jars because the apples fit perfectly inside of these. And if you ask your neighbors, they all have secret Talenti habits and they want to give you the jars to hide the evidence. And they stores very well, and you can mail them for the holidays. They are not very heavy and they won't break. So I'm definitely going to direct you to the Center for Home Food Preservation. Here's a fancy dehydrator. You could commit to a dehydrator. If you want to try one for less money, there are lots of them on Craigslist and in thrift stores and things like that. Occasionally there's one in a thrift store. So let's look at this. There it is. And it tells you, it says, how do I? And it tells you how to do everything, including fermenting, which I'm not going into much here. I do have a couple of fermentation links. Fermenting is a very doable project, and it tastes different from a vinegar pickle. It's not, the recipes on this site start with a little bit of vinegar, but most of the acid comes from action of the bacteria that are on the food that you are growing in your garden. And it makes a lactic acid solution, and it tastes different. I like it better than a vinegar pickle. Anyway, that's a great resource. And I'm not sure how much more we have to do. I think that is the end of this presentation at 7:30. Honey, ta-da! That's the end of that, folks. We're going to have John Fawcett. We're going to have a compost class, right?
We are. And that compost class, hold on a second. I'm going to put it in the chat.
Okay.
So everybody will know.
This is our second to last session. This is our last Zoom session of the year. And the next one, I'm going to go to it if I possibly can. But it's actually run by another person. What's John's last name?
Barut. John Barut.
John Barut, composter extraordinaire. It's an in-person demo and discussion at the library of composting, so you can grow your own fertilizer.
John was composting when the Dead Sea was sick.
Oh, long time.
He's been doing it a long time. Yep.
Long time.
And we have the Master Gardeners are at the library every Thursday from 3 to 5 p.m. through the end of September, which is when they stop for the year.
Interesting. John McInnes, may I ask you a question before we go?
Oh, sure.
How do you preserve your tomatoes?
Canning, mostly canning. But also I do freeze some because I get so many of them. This year, I don't plan on really preserving anything because I still have some from last year. So this year, I am giving away tomatoes as quick as I can.
Well, that's lovely.
Yeah, I have about 200 pounds so far.
Oh
And
my
then,
God.
yeah, and I expect to get last year I had about 400 total. I think I'm gonna get as long as I get a decent late September
Mhm.
and they still ripening in September, I should get up to 600 to 700 pounds of tomatoes this year.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. And John, earlier this year, John shared his favorite varieties of tomatoes. Um, I'm going to show you my favorite variety of peppers. That right there. Those are a sweet pepper, and it's called Carmen. It's quite successful here. I grow them under lights to get them started in the spring because peppers like to be planted out when it's plenty warm. But I usually get at least 8, maybe 12 of those peppers. You see the size compared to my hand. So those are big sweet peppers. They're delicious and they work out really well here. I'm going to have a lot of peppers because June was very warm. So the peppers are extra, the plants are extra big, and I have 16 peppers per plant at this point. So it's plenty of peppers. Yeah, it's a lot. But these are lovely peppers. And again, they are available in our farmers market typically. Betsy Wooding grows those. Other farmers, there are so many farmers in our farmers market. I advocate for you to go and see what they can offer even as late as November. You can go this weekend and ask them what do they offer later in the year. You're interested in storing things over winter. That kind of thing. It's a nice way to be able to continue to support our farmers in the area or wherever wherever you are. I'm talking about the Bainbridge Island one because I live 2 blocks from it, but there are many others. Paulsbo, right? Silverdale. There's at least one in Bremerton. I think multiple. Yeah. So we have our link, and thank you so much, everybody, for coming.